At the moment, we're living a true revolution in finance. ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. But how do you use that to invest? It all depends on what you want to achieve, because I'm here to recruit you as a responsible investor. My name is Jean-Jacques Barbéris, and this is my SaxoSession. So, what is ESG? If you are with me today, it's probably because you're interested into the concept. So ESG is a very barbarian word to encapsulate a variety of concepts and dimensions. If I had to make it very simple, I would say if you, like me, wear a pair of glasses, ESG would be a second pair of glasses you use to look at a company. The first pair is really looking at the company by looking only at its financial dimension. So basically, for instance, its profits, its dividends. But if you wear the second pair of glasses, which is ESG, you're going to look at everything that is considered as not financial. And generally speaking, what are the overall impacts of a company into the society the company operates. So from an environmental perspective, this is the E part of ESG. From a social perspective, this is the S part of ESG. And you're going to look at the G part, the governance. So by governance, we mean organization of the company, to make sure that the company is properly organized to address the challenges on the social side and environmental side. So hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Barbéris. I work in a company that is named Amundi. At Amundi, I'm basically in charge of two things. I'm first in charge of everything that is in relation to the institutional and corporate business. The other part that I'm covering at Amundi is to be in charge of everything that is in relation with responsible investment, which is the topic that we're going to discuss today. My previous role before joining Amundi was to be the economic advisor of the former French president, which means actually the current French president used to be my boss. And I'm particularly dedicated to the subject we're discussed today on a very personal basis. I'm the father of two young boys, one being 5, the other being 1. That may be the reason why I look a little tired today. And on a personal basis, this is a subject that I feel absolutely concerned about. And on a practical basis, what I try to do is to link what I do at Amundi and, I would say, this personal commitment. And I think there are 3 main reasons that one could consider to integrate ESG into its investments: risks, performances, and impact. First, it's about risk. If you consider, in particular, that, for instance, regulations are going to be tougher and tougher on companies that do not monitor their environmental impact, therefore, you need to integrate an ESG approach into your investment to make sure that you're not exposed to the ones that are going to be the laggards, and therefore that tomorrow will have a valuation that is going to be much lower than their peers. So first, this is about risk. The second is about performance. One could also consider that as there will be more and more demand for the best performing companies on all the dimensions of ESG, this could create this additional demand, an impact on prices, meaning that if today you invest into the companies that tomorrow have the largest potential of improvement of their extra financial performance, this could have a positive impact on the returns of your investment as well. And the third reason would be about impact, because this is, in your investment, you would like to generate a positive impact depending on the way you invest. And therefore, what you're looking for is to measure this positive impact of the companies you invest in throughout your portfolios. So ESG could be about risks, could be about performance, could be about impact, and one cannot be exclusive of the others. There are some solutions trying to combine the three. So let's take the E part, the environmental dimension, for instance. Here, we're going to assess the company depending on its environmental impact. Practically speaking, that could be, for instance, to see what is the evolution of the emissions, the CO2 emissions of the company throughout time. Does this company progressively reduces its greenhouse gas emissions? If I'm looking at the S part, the social part, here what we're going to look at is how the company contributes, either positively or negatively, to, I would say, the social equalities and the social dimension. What is, for instance, the average salary into the company in comparison to its top management? We're going to look at if the company pays its taxes properly or not. So how, in a way, the company contributes to the social equilibrium in the society it operates. And on the G part, the governance, here what we're going to look at is the company well organized and organized enough to make sure that it has the capacity to address its objectives? So namely, will ultimately the bonus or the shares that the CEO will get, are they linked to its objectives and its capacity to deliver the reduction of carbon emissions of the company? And so ESG really forms a triangle throughout all these dimensions, the way the company, in a way, behaves in the societies it operates in. So ESG is a new word, but in a way, investing for the greater good, or at least trying to, has been here for ages. So let's have a look at the ESG timeline.
In 2025, every third dollar invested in the world may be in environmental, social, and governance assets, and ESG assets could top $50 trillion by then. But the idea of investing for the greater good has been around for a very long time. It's believed that one of the first thoughts about ethical responsibilities as an owner of something, for instance as a shareholder, were written by Moses more than 3,000 years ago. Some of the first examples of ethical investing are from the Renaissance, where British Quakers and American Methodists opposed investing in unethical behavior, such as slave trading, smuggling, gambling, and even the toxic consumption of products, such as liquor and tobacco. In modern times, the push for ethical investment came from cultural and societal movements and events. The Vietnam War stirred civil outrage, and students demanded that universities pull endowments from defense companies. Catastrophes such as Chernobyl and the Exxon oil spill sparked worries about the environment and climate change that led to the creation of the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 1988. But it wasn't until 2005 that the term ESG was coined by the United Nations, which also created the UN Global Compact and the Principles for Responsible Investments, both of which help companies and investors incorporate ESG. Then came 2015, where climate change was definitely put on the agenda. The Paris Agreement was signed, and with that, the green transformation became a key focus for the financial sector. Since then, ESG has become more and more important for investors, and in 2021, ESG assets topped $30 trillion globally, making it an essential subject for any investor to learn about today.
So now I hope you have an idea of the timeline of investing for a greater good. Let's now discuss about what could be your ESG objectives. ESG is a unique word and a unique concept, but that really encapsulates a huge variety of dimensions. In a way, there is a lot of biodiversity of objectives into ESG. So it means by ESG, an investor can try to address very different types or sets of objectives. Some investors, for instance, consider they have a role to play to promote gender parity into the companies they invest in. And so therefore, an ESG strategy that can be followed would be to invest into companies while engaging with them to ensure that you meet a certain percentage of gender diversity into the different parts of the management of the company, top management or the board. On the other side, an investor like you may also decide to invest into companies based on their capacity to progress on the extra financial side, meaning I would like to invest into a company I believe that has a huge potential, for instance, to reduce its carbon emissions in the future, and therefore I believe that the value of this company will grow because this company will be, in its sector, one of the best companies according to that criteria. So we discussed about the objectives that one investor may have when it comes to ESG. Let's now talk about the associated techniques. So in a way, we discussed about the dish. Let's discuss about the recipes, to use a French metaphor. You may use a variety of techniques to address your ESG objectives. And these techniques, I will say, will be gradually more and more demanding depending on what your intentions are when it comes to ESG. So you can use, for instance, negative screening. You can use active screening. You can use ESG integration, or you can set yourself ambitions on impact you want to generate. So as an investor, you have different ways to meet your ESG objectives. We've discussed the first one, which is to integrate these objectives through various techniques into the management of your portfolios. But there is another way. If you're an investor, it means you are a shareholder. It means you own, particularly on the equity side, of course, a part of the company you invest in. And therefore, it means you have capacities to influence the company through your voting at the general shareholder meeting. And therefore, this is why another way to meet ESG objectives is to use that influence in the dialogue you have through your asset manager with the company. Investing is managing risks. This is historically what we do. And within the ESG spectrum, there are as well some risks that you can face if you invest directly into companies or if you do it through financial intermediaries such as asset managers. I would say that at the moment, from my perspective, there are three main types of risks. The very first one would be misunderstanding, the second one would be greenwashing, and the third one would be the risk of bubbles into the market. If I look first at misunderstanding, I think here it is always very important to understand that at the moment, there are no standardized definitions of terms like ESG, impact. There are no points of references. So understanding exactly what sits behind the word is key to avoid some embedded risk. The second type of risk is really about greenwashing. Greenwashing that you could face as an investor in investing directly equities into a company that claims, for instance, to have very sustainable strategy, but that in practical terms would not be the right one. As well, greenwashing can be embedded into strategies that would be run by financial intermediaries that would claim to be sustainable, but that in practical terms wouldn't be. The third type of risk is what I would call the risk of bubbles. And let's be explicit about that. At the moment, there are more and more investors that are selecting the stocks they invest in based on ESG criteria. This creates, very spontaneously, an additional demand, for instance, for the best ESG performing companies. It means that their stock price is higher. So now we've learned a lot about ESG. But now the question you may have is how to do it, how to practice it. And this is the focus that we're going to have, is to give you the types of instruments and techniques that you can use to integrate ESG within your investments. And here, I think the very first thing you should wonder is what are the objectives that you try to achieve? And this is probably the most important step for you, which is what do you want to do? Do you want to avoid to invest into some specific sectors or stocks? Do you want to integrate ESG for performance reasons? Or do you want to integrate it because what you want is to achieve an impact? This is the very first step and probably the most important one. And then the second step would be on what type of instruments shall I rely on to deploy ESG investments. And there you have two types of things to consider, either doing it directly by yourself, by investing directly into some stocks or bonds, or to use instruments that are at your disposal and that can be both on the active or on the passive side. The very first way to do ESG and to practice it is investing directly yourself into single stocks or single bonds. It means there you will probably have the maximum influence on what you're doing because you're going to decide the different investments you're going to do. But this solution that is probably the most cost efficient, because by definition you don't choose anyone else to do that, so the costs are just associated to execution of your own decisions, needs a lot of skills because you need to navigate into the type of stocks you're going to invest in. And it's probably, even if it looks simple because it's you doing it directly, it's probably as well the more complex. So if you do not do it by yourself, the other option is to rely on existing instruments. And you've got basically two types of instruments, one on the passive side and the other one on the active side. So let's focus first on the passive types of instruments. For the record, a passive instrument means that you're going to invest into a fund that is just trying to replicate an index, meaning to copy and paste an investment universe and to deliver exactly the same performance as this universe would deliver. And it's quite possible to integrate ESG into a passive type of investment. This is why exists what are called ETF, so exchange-traded funds, that are structured and constructed on ESG indices. It means what this instrument is replicating is the performance of an investment universe that is already integrating ESG objectives. So to take a very basic example, you have what are called Paris-aligned benchmarked ETFs, where basically the investment universe evolves in time according to a carbon reduction pathway towards carbon neutrality. It means progressively, the universe itself is excluding companies that are not on track with carbon neutrality. And the ETF that you can invest into is just going to replicate that. The pros and cons on the solution, on this type of solutions, are easy to understand. This is first simple. You don't really need extraordinary sophisticated skills to understand them. You just need to have the capacity to select them or to rely on your bank to explain to you what are the options available. It can be very impactful depending on the type of ETF you choose, and the cost is relatively limited. The alternative option is to select an active instrument. For the record, an active management means that here the portfolio manager is not trying only to replicate the investment universe he invests into, but tries to beat the performance of this universe by doing what is being called stock picking, meaning taking active decisions, that's the reason why we call that active management, in selecting what are the stocks to be in the portfolio. When it comes to ESG, active solutions have a lot of pros and cons. It's probably the ones throughout which you can generate the maximum impact because we can really design a strategy that is purely impact-driven. It is probably as well the solution that where the portfolio manager has the most influence on the choices that are ultimately made. The cons of the active management is clearly the costs, because active decisions is costly by definition. And in terms of skills, it's probably, I would say, the most accessible solution for the end investor, because you would rely mostly on the skills of the portfolio manager you select. But the truth is that at the moment, I would say the menu of options, depending on your objectives, is probably broader on the active side, because here the capacity to make tailor-made, sophisticated solutions towards very specific ESG objective is higher than on the passive side. So it's really a balance you need to take between the sophistication of the objectives you're pursuing or to something that is probably more accessible, surely cheaper, but maybe a little less, I would say, impact-driven. And the two options are absolutely, I would say, reliable when it comes to integrate ESG. It's just a matter, I would say, of techniques depending on the active side and the passive side. On the passive side, the thing you need to take care about is to select an instrument that is replicating an index that is integrating your ESG objectives. For instance, an index that is going to exclude some sectors or some stocks you don't want to be invested into. An index that evolves progressively in time according to the objective you may have, such as the carbon reduction footprint, as we already discussed. To conclude this session, please allow me for once again to put myself in your shoes. How can you start your journey on ESG based on everything we shared together today? I think the first thing that we shall all keep in mind is that it is now possible to try to invest responsibly and to integrate ESG into your investment decisions. The second thing we learned is that the impact that integration of sustainability into investment has on performance is not totally straightforward. In some categories of ESG investment, it is indeed a performance improver. But there are also some costs associated to some dedicated strategies, in particular the ones that are the most demanding in terms of climate impact. The third thing we learned is that it is possible for you to do these type of investments directly by yourself, which is probably the most easy way in terms of engagement and influencing your investments. But at the same time, it might seem complex, and there are solutions that providers like Saxo or Amundi can put at your disposal, both on the passive and active side, to help you throughout your journey. Because this is the next thing we all learned, it all depends, at the end of the day, on what you want to achieve. So think about what are your objectives, and this will lead you to choose what the best investment technique is. And I think the very last thing we learned is that ESG encompasses a number of concepts that are extremely complex to navigate in. So it's not simple to get into that universe. And we can hope that with the efforts of the financial community and also the regulators all around the world, more and more invest responsibly is going to be more transparent, more accessible, and ultimately, in the end, and that's what we all hope for, more impactful. So my name is Jean-Jacques. This was my Saxo session. Thanks you very much for watching.